discussed over a number of years the way that the nonprofit sector, a sector that primarily in many ways serves young people, operates in the way that again it perpetuates white supremacy. So it's a major topic in the book that we published a few years ago. One of the reasons why we thought it was important to begin to get more actively involved in policy work around education is because as we began to get a lot deeper in our work around challenging the nonprofit sector, we began to develop a greater understanding of the nonprofit sector as a part of a larger industry, the human social service industry, which include things like education, social work, public health, to the whole litany of industry or sub-industries within the human social service sector, education being one of them. And as I think about the perspective that we bring to the other policy efforts that we're involved in, one of the things that was very clear to me is that the discourse that is absent in conversations around education is around the centrality of the way that racism and white supremacy permeates in public education. And unfortunately, the discourse, the conversation around educational equity has been limited to conversations about poverty, conversations about poverty being a barrier to quality education. And while that's an important issue, one of the things that happens is that sometimes that focus is forwarded in a way that perpetuates the notion of white supremacy. Because what often happens is that just like in the nonprofit sector, you have white-led organizations and institutions who are both delivering services and advocating for policy that have not immersed themselves in the history and culture of the people that they serve. And so education just seemed to be an important next step in terms of the kinds of advocacy that leaders of a beautiful struggle wanted to get involved in. There are a couple of quotes that I want to give you that again set the context for this conversation. One, I'm actually paraphrasing Dr. Jacob Carruthers, who once said that on the battlefield of challenging racism and white supremacy, at the top of the list is the fight for the notions of intellectual superiority of white folks in society, and challenging that notion. And basically what that means is that in every arena of civil society, that people are forced to conform to an industry that sees white folks as having a level of intellectual superiority such that they are able to drive industries that serve people of color, and able to drive them in ways that benefit them more than it benefits our communities. Dr. John Henry Clark once said that the purpose of education, if your education does not train you to be an honorable and effective manager of power, it is a waste of time. And too often, the education that many of us, the way that we come to think about education is to produce more employees and produce more people that can fit into the system effectively, instead of honorable and effective managers of power. And so that's the context that I really want to have this conversation. Not in the traditional context of how do we improve test scores, how do we improve attendance, how do we improve people's access to job opportunities. And again, those things are important, but those things should not set the context for how we have conversations about those things. That particularly as people of African descent, we need to be looking at education from the vantage point of how we develop a system of education that reserves power for the community to determine the kind of education that will promote our interests. So that's really the context of the conversation that we're going to have today about education. And one of the pressing things that is happening now is the Kerwin Commission, which we'll definitely talk more about, an effort to equalize funding in education in the state of Maryland. And so we're going to talk about that, but in the context that I defined at the top, as opposed to the other way around. Too often we talk about the policy piece around funding and issues of racial equity as a subcategory in it. In this conversation, we're going to flip it, and that is our primary framework that we use to discuss any element and aspect of educational funding and policy. So what I'm going to first do is I'm going to ask the panelists just briefly to introduce yourself, an organization that you represent, and just briefly your interest in the topic of education. And so we'll start here and we'll go in that direction.
Hello everyone, my name is Jamal Jones. I'm co-executive director of the Baltimore Algebra Project, and I'm black, and I'm from Baltimore, East Side, and I'm not going to go nowhere. So that's my statement of education. That's like my primary state. The other thing is I have 2 other children, and what I've done is over the course of the last 10 years working through the Algebra Project, I've done with a whole host of young people in the educational system here on the municipal level and on the state level over the course of that decade. And so I'm familiar with some of the intricacies and some of the ways that they are explaining this.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Camila Harris. I like to call myself an equity navigator. I'm an education justice advocate for the past couple of decades. Let's see, I'm a mother of 3 Black Girl Magic having people. And while I was born in Brooklyn, New York, I've been bred here in Baltimore. I've been here for the past 23 years, landed when I was 16 at Morgan State University, and I've been living here in the community ever since. Many people fly out to the county and ask me why I still live in the city, and insist I live in the city is because I'm of the city, and I'm not going anywhere. So I've worked at the local, state level, and federal policy levels. I was the first deputy director for the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans. So I've been able to see how education impacts and happens to community and happens with community simultaneously. So I hope to bring that with us.
Good afternoon. My name is Kenyatta Kamoon. I'm the founder and director of Insaroma Academy for Holistic Thought. We also have Insaroma Holistic Daycare, and so this is an independent institution for children in Baltimore City. I have been recently told we are the only named African-centered school left in the city of Baltimore. And my stake in education in this conversation is that I would really like to be a part of changing the entire conversation and way that we look at educating our children. My expertise is in the area of early childhood education, so birth through 3rd grade is my primary focus. The years from which we determine how many jail cells will be built or how we look at college entry quantities. So I want to not just talk about how or have conversations about what's going on now, but really welcome conversations about critically thinking and examining what we want for ourselves as a society, and therefore what we want to do for our children to help us get there.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jessica Fauntleroy, and I am a mother of 3 children in the Baltimore City school system. At this moment, I am born and raised in Baltimore, educated in the Archdiocese of Baltimore school system, while being raised in the Sandtail community, from which Freddie Gray lived and died. I am a graduate of Morgan State University, where I earned a degree in social work, as well as Howard University, where I have a master's degree in social work. So for the past 12 years, I have worked as a social worker throughout the city of Baltimore in various organizations, from government-based to nonprofit organizations. Right now, I am working in the mental health industry, where I am working with a lot of children who are suffering through the effects of trauma in our communities, which has led me to have more of an interest in working in schools. I serve as the vice president of the PTA in my children's school, working to bring a more trauma-informed lens to what our teachers are doing with the children in the school that my children attend, as a parent as well as a clinician. So that is what I offer to this conversation, the role of a clinician as well as the role of a parent. Thank you.
All right, so one of the beauties of being able to host a conversation about education ourselves is to really be able to address issues that are hard to bring up in other settings. One of which is the fact that those of us that follow education policy, we're clear that the political fights are not about the kids. The political fight is about the money. And it's about resources and control of resources in order to pursue education, both as it relates to the schools, the public school system itself, and organizations that are proximate, that do out of school time, enrichment activities and such. So my question is, how important is it? Well, first, would you agree that is the dynamic, that it's really not about kids, it's about money and resources and power? And then secondly, how important is it to have that conversation in public? Because again, even when you look at the news and you see, what is it, Project Baltimore, so they're trying to, identify schools that, don't have any educational outcomes. But that's not about, we know that that's not about the kids. We know that that is a political fight that is about resources and dollars. So how true do you think that is, and how important is it that that conversation be in the front as we talk about both policy and we talk about solutions to education?
So first and foremost, absolutely, the issue is I want to rely heavily on resources, because sometimes it isn't necessarily about money but power and being able to yield, or not yield, wield authority over what happens to children and families for the sake of maintaining your own autonomy and your own seat at the table, right? And so one of my professors, my doctoral program, just wrote an article about failing schools in New Orleans. And in his comments, I said, I take issue with the concept of failing schools because school buildings are inanimate objects. It obfuscates away from the responsibility of adults to provide opportunity and access to children for high quality education. And to just say, if we close down a school building, that all of a sudden those kids are going to shift to another school building where the adults are more responsible, when we've seen that not to be the case, removes responsibility, right? It is, that's terrible what's happening to them over there, but I have no responsibility for it. Therefore, my taxes don't need to go to it. Therefore, if my kids are at a good school, I don't have to advocate for all kids to have a good school. But then when you take a couple of clicks back, the question is, what is a good school? And what do I want for my children? And do all children in the city have that? And I'm not saying every child in the city is going to go to a school with a sprawling campus, right? But there are some basic things that happen in schools in the suburbs, that happen in other cities, across schools, that cause students to be able to be managers of their own power, if you will. And so if we don't have this conversation in public, we will continue to remove responsibility from all of us sitting in this room and everybody across the city and state to discuss what responsibility we have individually, right? This concept and notion of society's responsibility to kids is very nefarious, but in fact our Constitution in this state says that we each individually have a responsibility to kids. But as long as the conversation gets couched in things like failing schools, or we need to make sure that the per pupil funding is fair and then everything will be great. Like, that is a distraction, because no one is having a conversation about our responsibility to provide the types of schools to kids that they were born deserving. So I think, if we don't have the conversation in public, we will keep having these half-assed side conversations about, which organization is providing the best after-school program, and where do we get our teachers from? Is it okay for those kids over there to have teachers with no training coming to their school 6 and 7 at a time annually, when I wouldn't allow that in my kids' school? For the sake of those organizations have a seat at the power table and are called darlings, and they do so great for our kids, but there's not really evidence of that after a couple of decades of implementation. So I think it's critical for us to have those conversations in public.
I think it's critical for us to have these conversations in public, because when schools fail and when schools close in communities based on them being failing schools, such as the one school that's still left in Sandtown, William Penderhughes, which is in the process of closing, I've heard. I think that when schools close in communities because they are failing, it gives the community the mindset that the community is going to continue to crumble. It makes people look at themselves as though they aren't worthy. that they aren't worthy to have a community that's going to thrive when you only have 2 schools in the community and both of them close. So what does that say about the projected future of that community? So I think that it is important for us to have these conversations publicly because it affects, the future of communities and the way that children feel about themselves in communities. It affects children's self-esteem. It affects families. And I think that that's why it's important for us to talk about these things publicly.
So in light of the fact that, it seems pretty clear that, again, education is really a political proxy for the contestation of power and resources. One of the things that I think is important to put in context is how are we defining what quality education is? And who are we allowing to define what quality education is? And I think when we talk about quality education, people say it as if there's a pretty common understanding of what that is and what that even means. What impact do you think that has, that how both we as a community define quality education, how those who are education reformers define quality education, parents define quality education, how important is that in having an effective conversation about what constitutes meaningful education reform?
I'll speak to that in one sense because I think about how we define education being taken completely away from the mouths and the minds of the children themselves. And I think that we negate the value of students to have a voice in how they'd like to be educated or what they'd like to see. I hear often, policymakers lean on the fact of saying, well, in certain communities we don't have, or in certain schools we don't have a strong parent support. And so we don't hear from our parents. And so obviously that goes back to ways that we can look at community engagement and things like that and what outreach programs are really effective and not effective, specific to certain communities. But also, one thing I think that we can share in is that in our experience, we have been around students, especially from upper elementary and up, who really have ideas, who have really great ideas, and they are not heard at all. So I would love to even see how we could, I don't know that there are too many industries that thrive, where in which those who are the principal partners of that industry are not heard from. It's a total miss that I think that we could grab a hold of.
Hey, so just to preface something, I'm going to be backing up during this panel. I want to give room and space for my queens to speak too. I just don't want people to think I talk. First thing. Second thing is, I think that if we go back and we have a conversation about this, I think one of the things that always is a very pointed thing is that when we talk about education, right, education is one thing, schools are different, but we center the conversation about education on schools, which heavily monetizes it, right? Like that, it creates school or education as a commodity, which then inherently makes it about resources every time, right? And then in terms of just kind of who should be consulted, right, one of the things about Algebra Project that's real specific is that the younger folks make all the decisions, and that's not to say that young people are always going to be right about schools. However, they are the most directly impacted. Similarly to the way that this conversation is being laid out, the communities of color are directly impacted primarily here. However, the folks at the table proffering to be the ones who are like the voice of the young people in Baltimore are not, right? So like that becomes a thing.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, when you ask, how the different groups of people see what education is, too often people do use that school alone identity, the school alone strategy, when there is no way in the United States of America that if you only seek to improve outcomes for children, that you focus in on schools alone. If parents don't have access to affordable housing, transportation, if those systems are not working with one another to food, right? You can't be telling me that you're working to improve schools. It's an impossibility because you are also sending that message to children that, that whole, oh, I got out of the hood. That's not a good thing to be saying to kids. Their communities have value. right? So if you're not investing in the communities holistically, but just saying, we want to focus on test scores. We want to, these 12 schools had no proficient child in reading. Okay, but did their parents get support when they were in utero or before they got to school to be the best parents that they could be? And if not, then do you really want to talk about reading levels, or do you want to talk about your intention for kids to read, right? And so usually it's the reading levels and not the intent for kids to read, because the system builds upon itself. And when we're talking about policy, it's going to be critical because research shows, and I'm a researcher also, research shows that parents generally rate schools as good if they feel like their kids are safe, right? And so it's incumbent upon a legislative platform to incorporate educating families around what the possibilities are for their kids. You can go to public schools in other places where kids have basic things as a part of their curriculum, like coding in middle school, like access to computer science in high school, so that they can be involved in the future of work. When you talk about being somebody who works at a factory, that's not coming back, but you damn sure better be able to code when you get out of high school, right? No matter what your career is going to be, it's going to be required. But do parents know they should be demanding that in curriculum? Do they know? Most parents don't know that. And even parents of middle class, upper middle class families, that tends to be already in existence at a basic level at their kids' school. Why would that not be the case if that is the future of our economy for everybody in our kids' schools? Well, that's because there's this hidden curriculum that people are unwilling to share across the board that gets back to the protection of resources. Like, I don't want your kids to be bad off. I want them to be doing a little bit better, but I need my kid to have coding in middle school, and I need my kids to have access to AP computer science as a base level, not because they're an honor student, right?
And I think even extended from that comment, and just being really direct, what impact does racism and white supremacy have on education, both the student experience in education, policy, and the institutions that are making decisions about what constitutes quality education?
What impact does white supremacy have on education and the policies?
That's what we got that question earlier.
Everything it is? I don't know. Again, speaking from my own experience, I'll just start from the space of why I created a school. Being a mother of two young African-American female students, potential students, having a daycare center, having families say to me, wait a minute, our children are turning 4. What are you going to do next? Because after what they received here, and be clear, it was an advanced curriculum, and it was all those wonderful things that children before 4 learned, polyrhythmic music, they learned foreign languages and things like that, but it was the love and the protection, like you said, the safety, that the parents were saying, what are we supposed to do next? And then I looked at my oldest daughter who was turning 4, and I said the same thing. And I ventured into, I live in Reservoir Hill, I'm a West Side baby, and I came back to Baltimore and settled right back, around the corner from my home, White Lock City, So I went to John Edgar Howard. I looked at John Edgar Howard as a public school choice because it's literally walking distance from me. And it's walking distance from the Mosbys. Neither of us sent our children there for a reason. And then I went and looked at private schools, which are completely out of price range for most middle class families. But then walking the halls of the private schools, I have to say, it wasn't worth making that sacrifice because I knew they wouldn't instill in my young girls what they needed to be good human beings. And that means more to me than the academics because I can do that at home, but I know many families can't. So I started my school because I needed them to be the kind of human beings this world needs. And I needed to feed into them what I knew they needed to be. And white supremacy sets a standard so that young black children, male and female, cannot see themselves. They can't know themselves, they can't love themselves. And it's unfortunate when that is, it's subversive and hidden, but it's also right there on the forefront if you know how to see it. But most of us aren't educated to know how to see it, or are not empowered once we see it to do anything about it. Every family can't start a school. Every family can't homeschool. I charge the lowest tuition possible, which keeps us at a deficit, but families can't afford that, you know? So there's just this matrix where in which if we are choosing to live in Baltimore City and pay these high property taxes, we know though that we have no options, and I mean no real options for our children. And that is a painful reality that we've got to look at when we look at policy. It's like, there's a three-system question that I've been taught to ask in terms of mindful thinking. Has it been done before? What was the result or outcome? And if I didn't like that outcome, will I repeat it? And that's just basic critical thinking. But we're repeating these same things over and over and living in an impoverished state no matter what our income level is, because our children are impoverished. And that is that's under this whole system of white supremacy. So really everything.
And Khalil, before you answer that, just to add a layer to that, because one of the things that I hear a lot of ed reformers say is that the critiques of public education are not helpful. It undermines education reform because it undermines the ability to advocate for more investment in public schools. So it's kind of a tricky position, right? Because on one hand, we're clear that we don't want to send our kids to public schools because we know what the outcomes will be. But on the other hand, we're in a context where ed reformers are talking about more resources for the public school system that we want to send our kids to. So I think that puts us in a tricky position, which I think is a part of the function of white supremacy and how it operates.
So, oftentimes when I do public speaking, I like to give a disclaimer, which is apologizing up front for stepping on toes, but it's really only so we all stand up straight, okay? Let me talk about myself a little bit, because it's hard to be reflective in a space and then not acknowledge how you may contribute to the issue. But folk like me, college educated, middle class, I have kids in public and private schools. Folk like me are a big part of the issue and need to be called to task about their accountability to their own community. We have, I'm a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha, we have members of Black Greek-led organizations that do these chintzy tutoring programs and mentoring programs that serve 7 kids in one school, and they, make billboards about their service to the 7 kids at the one school. And these are folks that pull up to meetings in a Lexus and send their kids, live in Owens Mills, and send their kids to school over yonder, folks grew up over east and over west, right? Okay, so I said I'm talking about myself. I'm talking about myself, okay? And so when you talk about white supremacy and the way it determines goodness, right? You blacks over here are good. You blacks over here are bad. You kids over here are good. You deserve access to be able to go to the basketball game after school. You kids, I'm going to take away your bus tickets that allow you to just sit at the basketball game, whether or not you play basketball, so you can experience a full education the way my kids just go to the basketball game and paint their faces and wave pom-poms at 8 p.m. at night, right? Because I can drive my Lexus over there to take them, I can drive my Lexus back to bring them home. So when you think about the ways white supremacy forces us to think about ourselves and what the standard of goodness is, and this concept of the markets in education, right? Market reform is going to cause schools to be better, right? The more choice you have in school. So I am not anti-choice, I am not pro-choice, but let's not pretend families have choices, right? I have choices because of the income I make. I can choose to move to Owens Mills. I can choose to supplement the scholarship my kids receive for private school. You can't tell me I have a choice between schools that are not functioning well because of adults' failures, or this one charter school over here that I'm going to climb on top of somebody else to get access to. That's not school choice. Now, if we have some charter schools here, and some traditional schools here, and some parochial schools here, and 4 or 5 in Saromas over here, that is school choice. That's school choice. But we pretend and we hide behind the ed reform language about what makes good school and what are the test scores. What are the test scores? Well, if the scores are bad, close the school. You're playing yourself. If the scores are bad, close the school. What is your score? Are you hiring principals that have culturally relevant approaches to pedagogy? Right? What is the principal score? Are you hiring teachers that look like the kids in your school? Right? I've challenged my kids' principal about the fact that they couldn't have a black teacher their entire elementary school experience in a public Baltimore City school. How does that work? Hello, thank you, right? So how does that work? It works because we're not asking the right questions. We have bought into a concept of what goodness is, and that is in fact white supremacy, right? I'm gonna tell you what the norm is for your children, and you need to buy into that and support it, because that is what's right. And frankly, the black middle class does a disservice to itself, because white supremacy also says, even when you enter into my space, I'm not going to give access to your child, right? And you don't see it. You think I've made it to the mountaintop here at the private school. Or I've made it to the mountaintop because I can live in Mount Washington and watch my kids walk while I sip coffee and talk to all the moms in their running gear, right? I've made it. But you've made it nowhere, because there's still a hidden curriculum that is going to box your child out when they get on Harvard's campus and they don't get access to how they become a Rhodes Scholar, or how they get that initial investment to open up their Facebook, right? And so it's incumbent upon us to hold ourselves accountable when we talk about white supremacy, which is not over there. And I've been having a lot of conversations with people where when the word supremacy comes up, like they want to pass out, somebody give them a mint julep. You're not talking about me. I'm not a white supremacist. Do you benefit from white privilege? That's it. I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm not calling you a bad person. I'm not calling you a racist. But you do uphold white supremacy by your unwillingness, right? I think I just commented on your post that there aren't people getting on buses to demand that all students have access to culturally relevant curriculum. But there are people getting on buses to make sure they don't have to raise a couple $100,000 extra than they already raise at their public school to make sure that their kids have the same quality of education that other kids in the city don't have, right? Buses full. Where are the buses for more teachers of color, right? Where are the buses for ensuring that, the rubric for evaluating schools, evaluating the school district, evaluating the school leaders includes a lens of cultural responsibility in Black Baltimore?
So can I ask you, so I'm gonna ask you this and then ask other panelists to comment on this, because you mentioned the notion of what constitutes goodness as being a part of that wedge that determines where resources go, who's considered in the club, who has access to certain activities and programs. And what it sounds like you're saying is that notion of goodness has actually been, it has stifled the ability for us to advocate for the kind of education reform that actually empowers the community. It seems like what you're describing is that most people's trajectory to quality education is gaining access to other people's institutions, as opposed to thinking about how we as a community see education in a way that benefits our community and building the infrastructure to provide that for ourselves.
Listen, you all have heard this before, all your skin folk and your kinfolk, and oftentimes people who are aligned and adjacent to white authority and white power are given access to lead organizations so that folk can say in Black Baltimore, look, there's a Black person heading that. I think we've covered this, right? It's covered. They told us what you people want, right? But in actuality, that is their kinfolk that is leading that organization, and not necessarily our kinfolk. And sometimes those folk have a little radical gene coming through them, which you can't help when you are of the ancestors. But you have now bought into what is good. And so you now need to maintain your seat at the table and say things like, well, if I don't have a seat at the table for you guys, who's going to speak up for you? Well, I don't want to sit at your table. How about that? Right? We got a table over here. We can chop down some wood and make our table for our feast over here. And too often people aren't willing to do that. They are so intent upon making sure they have their seats so they can represent brown people when the genesis of their pathway into education is rooted in other people telling the community what's good for them, right? So it just because somebody looks like you doesn't mean that they're for you, and that's why we need a Black legislative agenda that holds ourselves accountable, going back to myself, holds ourselves accountable. I don't take accountability. Why are your kids at private school? If you take accountability, are you willing to go with me, all 5 of us, and put our kids at John Eager Howard? If all 5 of us going to do it, we're going to do it. But you're not wherever, right? But you're not going to call me to the carpet, and you're not willing to put some skin in the game with your own family. You know, growing up in Brooklyn, you got mamas and mamas everywhere. You can send your kids to the Schoenberg Center on the weekend to have a myriad, to the public library, to the Brooklyn Museum of Art. Like, there's so many places you can send your kids where they see themselves and their history beginning prior to the 1600s. And that's also not present or valued in Baltimore in a way that it ought to be in a Black city, right? And so how are we creating those spaces for education, right? Not just schools, right? If we believe in education, the question is, what does quality education look like? Not just this individual good school, because as long as we move in a schools alone strategy and we're willing to rate this school A, this school B, this school C, we are playing a game that's never going to work out for our kids.
That's my comment on that.
I wanted to comment, I wanted to say that one of the things I believe that affects our ability to, improve institutions is the notion of inferiority. I think that a lot of people have taken in this notion of inferiority that makes them feel like they're unable to mobilize together to demand certain things from the administration of their children's schools, from their children's teachers, from the leadership that is responsible for these institutions to our children. And I think it's because some people feel like they're unworthy to ask questions and to make demands when that is their right. So one of my stances as a parent has been to go into my children's school if I feel like there is something that is not being done correctly for them, and to talk to the principal, and to talk to the vice principal, and to talk to the teachers, and to talk to the instructional support teacher, and to speak with whoever I need to speak to make sure that things are being done in the correct way for my children. And as my children have gotten older, I have a 7th grader, and because this is my 8th year dealing with the school system, it's made me want to become even more active and help other parents. Because some people really feel like they don't have a choice. And that's because of this internalized inferiority that is as a child of white supremacy. So I think that is something that affects, especially in the city of Baltimore, I really think that affects parents. Because people will always say how, well, the parents don't come out to so-and-so night. The parents don't come to the PTA meetings. Sometimes parents don't feel like they're smart enough, that they know enough to come sit at a table with a teacher or principal, or to advocate for the things that they need for their children. And then another thing that I wanted to say was that when it comes to education in Baltimore City and impoverished neighborhoods, that quality education is holistic. It takes into account everything that's going on in the community. How can you teach a child? You can come and teach a child about English and math and expect them to be able to learn when maybe in their community yesterday 3 people were killed. Maybe they didn't have dinner. Maybe no one in their household is working. They have these different psychosocial issues that are impacting their lives, but we don't have programming in schools, not in every school in Baltimore City, to address those issues. And so I think that that's something that we can do or introduce. I know that at the Kerwin Commission, the meeting that they had at Poly, a lot of community advocates were talking about the need for community schools and wraparound services, and that is something that hopefully the Kerwin Commission has taken into account when they talk about per pupil funding and models for schools. So that's all I'm going to say.
So I want to say 2 things, and then kind of shift the conversation. So to that point about internalized notions of Black inferiority, I think that plays a much bigger role than I think people consciously realize. One of the things that over the past few years I've recognized that I was fortunate enough to be in an activity, a policy debate, rigorous argumentation, great evidence laden, competing at the highest levels, and I remember debating, you talking about Harvard, Northwestern, Michigan State, and one of the things that became increasingly clear to me was how mediocre a lot of those folks were. Like, we're talking about people who, it's really the prestige of the name of the institution, right, that people are intimidated of, but when you actually are competing against them in intellectual combat, that many of them fall way short. And I think it's always been helpful for me, a lot of times when people talk about like culturally responsive pedagogy, I see it as, particularly as it relates to people of African descent, like really having an understanding of the intellectual accomplishments of people of African descent, both contemporaneously and prior to the Middle Passage, so that, because many people of African descent have not seen narratives or heard a lot of narratives of people of African descent engaging in high-level intellectual endeavors that would give both young people and their families the sense that they can compete. And so that's why I think a lot of times people don't show up to those meetings because of that kind of prevailing framework. One story, when I was a high school teacher for a couple of years, I won a national debate championship in 2008, and I had a picture of myself, my debate partner, and the trophy on the wall, but I never talked about it, I just had it up. And so my students, one time, they looked up and they were like, Mr. Love, why is this a picture of you? Who's that with you? And I was like, well, that was me and my debate partner. We were some of the best debaters in the country. And they looked at me, they said, Mr. Love, why are you lying? And of course, we laughing. And I said, why do I have to be lying? And what they said, Mr. Love, if you all that, then why are you here with us? Wow. So I think that notion of internalized black inferiority is something that really animates a lot of what happens in terms of how institutions are structured, how curriculum is delivered, etc. So what I want to use that to transition to, because there are two other places I want to go before we open to the audience, the Curran Commission, and looking at education reform. I would argue that, as I mentioned in the beginning, about really the ineptitude of the nonprofit sector, being white-led and corporate, that many of the methodologies that have been used to deliver services to young people, clearly over the past decades have shown have not had significant impact on improving the quality of life of young people in those communities. And I would argue that those same folks who are in positions of leadership in the sector that receive dollars to work with you are the same people that are in charge of engineering what we call education reform. I posted something this week about the Baltimore Education Coalition and about that most of the organizations that are in that are the kinds of organizations that have been a part of the status quo. Right? These are organizations where notions of racial equity are like extra, right? It's additive. That understandings about even how racism and white supremacy operate are things that they see themselves as leading education on, which makes my head explode. That you could lead education reform, and in a predominantly black city where most of your students are people of color, people of African descent, and not be equipped, not feel intellectually equipped to really address the issues of race and racism and how they operate with folks of African descent. How important is it? So you mentioned the Commission. How important is it that we challenge the organizations that are in position to pursue policy changes that will impact our students? How important is it that we seize leadership in education reform as a pathway forward? Because and the reason I ask that question is I think some people see it as like a personal attack. They see it as, oh, they're being mean. They don't like white people, right? That's the discourse that often we get in response to that criticism. So I'm curious, how important is it as we think about the Curran Commission, which is an opportunity statewide to change the funding formula so that education funding is equalized and is targeted to communities that are most needed those resources? How important is it that we challenge the organizations fighting for that on their ability to lead such an effort?
All right, so two things. One is I feel like it's so important. I actually don't know if this is the right question. It's more like how do we do it? Because it's imperative, right? We have to if we want to change how things are moving. And the second thing that I want to do is I wanted to back up a little bit just to answer that question about white supremacy and how empire functions in education. So education as it is white supremacy. Like inherent. Like it is white supremacy. Like the extent of it, right? So I wanted to go back to two things. Well, I want to reference two things. So if you go back, remember the Federal Housing Act, right? White folks got a bunch of money to be able to build all this cash cows for all of these houses, right? Do a bunch of stuff, property taxes go up, people can buy these houses, there's cash coming in, right? You hit the 80s, you got a bunch of white flight, right? I'm gonna take my money with me. I'm leaving the city, I'm taking my money with me. Then you get to the late 90s, Baltimore City, as a result of this disinvestment, right, has a lot less, lower educational outcomes, right? So then we have to parcel out our education system to the state, which then puts the burden back on the people who left, right? And they are at the intersection of providing educational service and being also seen as the authorities while also having their tax dollars, right? That's why this keeps being back to money, right? Because ultimately folks left still have to spend their money on places that they don't identify as important, right? Places where black people are just not important, right? Annapolis folks say that Baltimore is the black hole, right? That's a thing. People say it. I don't really get how we could get past that. The other thing is, I wanted to so this part test piece, right? It's also that being at the intersection is real important, right? Because part of those folks can say what they want to recommend and what they don't recommend for education spaces, right? Interesting fact, I feel real bad about this as an oversight as someone who sees themselves as a part of this educational ecosystem and trying to champion the work. The part test is the test that this Project Baltimore stuff was all based on, right? I had a moment the other day where I was talking to another person who cares very much so about neighborhoods in Baltimore, and what I realized was that the part test is given out on the computer, right? It's a computerized test, and it begins in 3rd grade. How many 3rd graders are oriented with keyboards in the way for the alphabet that they got taught in school? And then we give them a test on the computer, and they have to be able to, one, take in that information, figure out where the keys are, and then answer. And then we wonder why we don't have good scores, right? We spend half the test trying to figure out where the hell E is. It's just, that's just a thing. And just to kind of piggyback that, right? Just kind of, again, not being mean, right? But I remember before, Algebra Project was a part of the Baltimore Education Coalition. And the point that we pulled back was the 2013-14 year, right? Transform Baltimore had become a thing, right? Like the campaign won, we got the $2.1 billion. And what ended up happening was that Jacob's report was released. A bunch of, again, other folks telling us was good for us, right? You guys got to close a bunch of schools. And again, my sisters have already said, since when do you close schools? And that's a useful thing, right? We at Algebra Project brought that to leaders in Baltimore Education Coalition, as folks kind of said, they fit the profile of this intersection, the space where this intersection is, and said, look, people are outraged that schools are going to close. You're talking about 26 schools. I was told to my face, right, by the same people who are in this intersection, that actually schools closings are not a part of our legislative agenda. That's not a part of our work plan. It's not what we do. You have to wait 3 years until our next planning retreat to try and get that to be a thing, as if the schools were not beginning to close there. And at that point, it became very clear whose agenda that was serving, and we had to pull out.
So, I don't know, I struggle about taking over an entity that's not set up to hear black voices or support black voices. In some ways, it's like let them rock and do something else. Definitely have some people in the room, but why do what you have is not what's right. So it's good, but I don't see that as the pinnacle of what I need to have. This gets to a question around how we tell our stories and where our stories are told, and how we also need to, when we talk about education, invest in black media. Because if we have a functioning black-led institution or coalition that is holding stakeholders accountable, then who's telling the story? I don't know that we wait on the Baltimore Sun to tell the story. I think we need to make sure there are other spaces that are talking about the work behind the scenes to get community engaged. And when you talk about families not feeling like they're smart enough to deal with teachers, a lot of families were oppressed in schools themselves or treated poorly in schools themselves. So it's an institution that oftentimes families feel like, I don't want to go in there because it's not a place where I recall having good experiences. Now I'm going to go in there because my child is there, but I reject it when people say those parents don't come to schools. Why are those parents buying their kids Jordans? Because can their kids have one nice thing? It's okay. All right, sorry, I diverge. The other thing is with the current commission, whatever we're pushing for the commission to do, and we need to have also conversation about equity versus equality, which are not the same thing, right? Equity versus equality. As long as we ask for equal, we will not have enough because we didn't start at the same place. We need to be pushing for equitable access to opportunities and resources. Also, when you talk about white supremacy and what the current commission recommendations are, and should we be challenging them to have a racial justice lens, we want to make sure that we're talking about an asset-based frame and not a deficit-based frame. So we can't just say we want community schools because, many kids are traumatized. There are children who aren't traumatized. There are families that are solid and whole in these very same communities. So we can't just blanketly talk about the community as if every child coming to the schoolhouse needs fixing. Right? And so we're talking about community schools, it's because this community has been having a family circle in Ms. Jenkins' basement, and the school should be a place where they can do that, so more families can participate in it, right? Like there is an asset in the community that we want to make accessible because it works for the families in it. We want to make it accessible to many more people, so how are we making the school a place that can be an anchor for the good things that are happening in the community, not just to fix the problems in the community, right?
So in light of that, so I think one of the things I'm hearing is that it probably doesn't make sense to think, and I'm in agreement with this, that institutions that have governed themselves the way they have, proximate to the issue of education reform, it doesn't make sense to expect them to change their practices or even to develop the deep understanding necessary to move in the direction we need to, but rather kind of organize ourselves and that any entity can decide whether to follow our lead as a community or to do their own thing. And I think that's a position that I think makes a lot of sense, and a position that one of the things that LBSB look forward to do is helping facilitate such an environment where we can come together as a community that are directly connected to those most directly impacted, that are not folks that just are privileged enough to be proximate to the white corporate nonprofit sector, to really chart leadership to what it looks like to have racial equity. I think in the meantime, and this is kind of the last place we'll go, and then we'll start with some audience Q&A. Some of the things that we should be doing in the meantime. So for instance, like we have Insuroma Academy, and one of the things that I've experienced in conversations with ed reformers when I would talk to them about the importance of Black-led educational institutions, the response I would get was, well, who are they, right? And of course they wouldn't know, right, because they're not in communities enough to know what we know about what exists in our communities. So really my last question is, what are some things that we should be doing in the meantime? So while we're kind of doing the policy work, right, challenging the ed reform movement and its deficiencies and kind of building our own agenda, what are some things that we should be doing in the meantime? And one of the things I want to highlight, for instance, is alternative educational institutions that, again, don't have the same platform but are providing valuable services to our community. What are some things we can do in the meantime in terms of supporting institutions like Insuroma, other organizations like it, or just alternative means for education for our young people that we can be doing in the meantime parallel to the work on policy?
If I can reiterate, we definitely need to expand and share with families what the possibilities are for their children. Because when it comes to the policy, parents will then get on the bus to say, oh, we need funding to do this that my child deserves and they don't currently have. I'm on the bus because they need to have coding in every middle school in Baltimore City. But as long as people are snatched up for this, it's a I don't know, it's a fire every time. Like, it's a fire, we're about to lose funding. It's hard to then get people to wrap their minds around policies that long-term will strengthen the community and prepare their kids to manage their own power. So, in the meantime, as policy is devised, we definitely should be exploring the possibilities of what quality education looks like with each other, so that when it's time to build a policy around that, people are ready to go because they know what they're asking for the policy for.
I'll say from having an institution, there are several things that we can do in the meantime. And I think that it builds around community, and it builds around the pursuit of collectivism. These are the things that, I mean, enrollment is not a new concept. It's something that's built on the shoulders of our ancestors. You know, it is Mary Calvin, it is Cookman, it is all these things that, you know, got us to where we are now. It is how we were educated when we were not given equitable educational opportunities. And like my brother here said, you know, education is not just school. Enrollment exists in an old farmhouse on Garrison Boulevard. We literally have prostitutes walking in front of our building. But inside our gates, we literally have an organic farm that feeds our children fresh kale and strawberry and cherry tomatoes. You know, when you want to make a salad. So everything is possible. Every single thing is possible. We need resources, obviously, and always, and we need the ability to build infrastructures that can withstand the challenges that face anything that we do. But within our communities, everything is possible. We have really everything we need already available. So I think, to your point, Kalila, we do need a way to show our community members what's available. I mean, here in Pastor Huber's church, this is an opportunity, this is an example of what's available with Orita's Cross. It's a freedom school, and it offers, again, organic food to the community, not just the children who come, and programming that enriches sense of self and sense of purpose. So we know that these programs, there are things that exist all around the city, and what I think would be of benefit is to work in a stronger way together. And I know we're already in forward momentum of doing this, where we are positioning ourselves to make sure that everyone knows it. This kind of Baltimore thing, this east side, west side, you know, whatever, all these borders, we can be proud, but we have to know that we don't own that. So we also want to look at borders as really, you know, impermanent things, and find ways to connect. And then I would say that we also have to constantly challenge outside communities who do already have access to resources, because we do need buildings. We do need to come out of our basements. We do need to have more space. We do need to have land. We do need to have opportunities, computers and things like that for our programs. So we have to challenge our allies, people like those who are in the room who may not identify as African American, but know that you want to see something different because this is your city too. And if you have children or grandchildren, nieces or nephews in this city, and you want them to be safe and you want them to be good citizens, then you have to model for them what you want them to do and be. And that means reaching outside of your comfort zone to be a true asset to things that are already established. Because I guarantee you this, things that are in place now, whether it's Orita's Cross, whether it's in Saroma, whether it's Habisha or Rio's Eye, all these programs that exist in this city, they are for and run by people who already know what the problems are and are already providing solutions and have been for decades. So we're already here, but we need support, continuous, ongoing support.
I just wanted to echo what the sister just said. You know, so I think that one of the ways that, you know, we can build is supporting organizations that are already doing work that is benefiting our communities. People who have already been, because, you know, I think that one thing that is happening now is that a lot of people are they're reinventing the wheel when they really don't need to, because we already have institutions that are in existence that do the work in communities, that understand the communities, and that are already serving communities. So it's a mix of us supporting things that already exist, as well as the collective thing that my sister talked about, where mothers and fathers and grandparents and community members work together to educate our children, not just on, traditional education, but on skills that will help them to be able to create a positive quality of life for themselves and to be able to have a positive life in general. So those are things that will be able to help us moving forward.
So after Jabal, we'll start with some Q&A.
Cool. I was just gonna say first, we should start with young people, right? Even in this space, we're lacking, and part of this is, again, proximity to the problem, right? And I mean this in a different way, right? Typically, when we think of young people, we think of ourselves as like building them to be good people, right? As opposed to them being active agents in like their own development. That is a key approach that really backs all of what we're talking about, right? The idea that we teach young people to be like self-reliant, give them actual decisions to make, opportunities to fall so that they can pick themselves up, and that we as people who care are right there, right? As opposed to, let's create this very neat image so that we can keep the money flowing. Because that's what happens. That's how we end up with our young people tokenized. The second thing is, we all in this room got to hold each other accountable. Alvin Project used the 3 tiers of demand system, but one of those tiers of demand is like holding it. The first one is holding yourself accountable. The second one is holding your peers accountable. The third is holding the larger society. We typically jump straight to larger society because it's the easiest. We can just say, yo, that's the societal problem. Get it together, society. Right? We can do that. As opposed to saying, system, you tripping. We're being like, Mo, get it together. Right? And like, I say that to say, we all know about our programs, we know about all the work that we do, and we watch them say, we don't know, and then we're like, they don't know, we know. But actually, what we need to be doing is saying, stop talking to them, talk to me, right? Go down to Annapolis and be like, yo, why are you talking to them? We've had the same result for over a decade. How many times you go bang your head up against the wall before you come holler at me and my people, right? We gotta say words in front of people, in front of cameras. This is cool in here, right? What about in Annapolis, at the rallies, when we see, right, our counterparts very clearly creating this counter-narrative to what we're trying to produce? And then the third thing is really producing a narrative that combats this idea of schools being, like, education being school-centric. If we can really shift what it looks like to have a conversation about education to really be based on education itself, then I think what will happen ultimately is that this argument about the people will stop focusing on the money and have to focus on the people inherently, right? So if we shift the narrative away from what it's been, and we actively do that every day with our tweets, with our Facebook posts, with all of the things, everyone has an institution that they're a part of, like pushing this piece about changing that narrative away from schools, I think we're going to end up better, because I don't see why, like, programs that are running that are running in community aren't giving out credits to people for being a part of their program. It doesn't make sense to me. That's where you're having the largest impact. That's where your people are. But I go backwards. I lie. It's because education right now is white supremacy. So why would it?
All right. Questions? Like Lady Bregon said in the beginning, we want to encourage people to ask questions, be concise, so we can get as many as possible.
My question on my understanding of education in a given society is either to reinforce that society or change it. Okay, if you are an oppressed people and you're dealing with education, I have been saying I have not heard capitalism brought up one time in the role of education in a capitalist system. So that's my question to y'all. How do you see these different things? You talk about white supremacy, we had a panel before this. All right? All of this is coming out of capitalism. How do we have discussions like this and not deal with capitalism?
Thank you, sir. So if I can be more precise when I talk about the future of work and technology as the future of work, I want to weave that needle right to the place of capitalism, because our children cannot be left out of the economy. We can definitely build and reinforce a different type of society, but ultimately, we need resources to buy land. And so if Jamal Jr. is charged with going off and creating this app that we can't live without, or this web-based platform that we can't live without, we need to make sure Jamal Jr. has those resources, because he doesn't know that when he's 12, right? But if he never even had the resource and he's continuing to catch up to the place where everybody else is, there's, my kids are not Gen X, they are Gen Z, right? Those kids know no world where there was not an internet. Their kids will know no world where there's even a question, right? So we need to make sure our kids are equipped for the world that they live in. And I'm saying the future of work, but the future of work is today, right now. The kids right now in high school all should have access to computer science as a literacy, just like they have history, English, and mathematics, but they do not. Middle schoolers should have access to coding courses as a base literacy, but they do not. And that is about capitalism, because as long as our children are on the outside of the economy, capitalism will be being done to us. It will not be it will be a system that we continue to be on the outside of and be spending generations upon generations trying to catch up when it comes to building generational wealth.
Well, thank you all for the panel and for all of your insightful words on education. I wanted to touch on a couple of threads that were brought up during the conversation. We talked a little bit about gatekeeping of the white lobbyist world in the education reform process and for the education system conversations. Also talked a little bit about, I guess, the transition of the focus onto education as opposed to the structure of it. But I would really like to pull back to that question of structure and ask you a question around that. We have a current system that's structured in a way where we have a chief of staff, a CEO, a chief of staff, a COO, executive directors that are in charge of networks of schools, and principals that have to report back to those executive directors on how they're managing their assets and how they're managing the 80% of the budgets that they're in control of at each of those schools. And so I wanted to kind of hear some words from you on your vision of not only creating a feedback loop for that system as a whole, the processes that are undergone through that system, such as like the requirement for Teach for America to have certain slots. So what kind of restrictions can we put in place to limit or mitigate that harmful impact given the structure is what it is, but also what can we do to transition away from the current educational structure we have in the city?
So maybe to paraphrase, what do we do about the actual structure of the education system? CEO, COO, chiefs of staff. Is there a change that needs to be done to that? And additionally, what are some ways that the community can have the power to interact with that system in a way where there's actually some accountability? So if I'm paraphrasing that correctly.
So I don't want to monopolize, but I happen to know a lot about this. In particular, having run a school in the district. When you say principals have, I'm going to approach the question differently. When you say principals have control over 80% of their budget, they actually have control over 0 of their budget, because unless the principal is proposing to do schooling in that schoolhouse very differently and calling on the district to allow them to implement an educational program very differently than the traditional school structure, they are just being told you have 6 teachers or 7 teachers. You decide if you want 6 teachers or 7 teachers, and then you take the money from the 7th teacher and use it for after-school programs or athletics. And if you don't want to use it for after-school programs or athletics, maybe you use it to hire 2 paraprofessionals. Right? That's not control over their budget. So the principals haven't really been positioned, even through the network structure now over a decade, to establish models of instruction and implementation of pedagogy that is different than what was already there. You have principals that, for the most part, are still doing the school district curriculum. The school district's curriculum requires a certain staffing model. So you're not in control of 80%, you're in control of 0%. Now, if you're telling me you have schoolhouses where school leaders are saying, I would like to do this. I would like to have an implementation model where there are co-teachers in every classroom. I'm going to reduce the number of assistant principals. I would like to ensure that every child has access to the arts. And so we're going to reduce the time on reading test prep and math test prep, because we're going to provide a curriculum that's not built around passage of the park, that's built around educating the whole child. And then they get pushback from the district, then we can start holding people accountable. But before we get there, principals need to be equipped to do that. And I think a good place to look in that case is both students and teachers, right, who have great ideas about how to run schools. And right now, teachers are put in a position to leave teaching if they want to be able to provide for their family, right? Either they have to leave teaching or they have to become an administrator. And 9 out of 10 teachers I know don't want to do that. They don't want to be an AP or a principal. But sometimes you get put in a position where you may be the sole breadwinner, not only for your own family, but an auntie or a mom who might be elderly at that point, or your nephew, who, if your sister is departed, or whatever the framework is. So going to educators and families and children about what the school should look like, then we can start talking about a structural shift. Then we can say to central office, okay, you have 10 people supervising networks, but that's not going to work because you have these different school models. We need some of that money to come down to the school, because I agree, all classes should be co-taught. There should be content being taught across curriculum where they build upon one another. Or this high school should be freshman and sophomore year, they have content, junior and senior year, the kids go out into the community and work, and the way that their graduation promotion looks like is them continuously talking about a project that they're practically applying what they learned in freshman and sophomore year to. Until those changes occur, it's hard to talk about changing a structure that's built to support itself. So,
I don't have a question, but I wanted to support everything that has been said by the panelists and also by what Yahya said. Yahya, he was quoting Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, about convene education. And I also support what Yahya said about that capitalism wasn't really mentioned. Now, I think a better term, or a more accurate term to be used would be capitalism, and to help people understand the role of racism and white supremacy. White supremacy mollifies them, and so they support capitalism in helping it to exploit all other people who are not white and to oppress them.
Thank you. And so one of the things that appreciate the comment. I think one of the things that in terms of the approach to the conversation that we're having today about legislative and policy reform is not to exclude the importance of that conversation. There are those of us that talk extensively about white monopoly capital, the way white supremacy organizes, the way resources operate, and their high-level debates that folks can have about the kind of meta structure from which that we're in. So I don't want you to feel like we're not interested in addressing that concern, but in the context of looking at specific policies and looking at what are the things that people can do in the meantime that are informed by that, that's kind of what the conversation has been centered on. And I encourage you and others to come to our Malcolm X talk where we get deeper in some of those larger scale conversations about structures and systems, kind of above and beyond just education. So I don't want you to get the sense that we're ignoring that. And so we have to go to the next question. We only have 5 minutes to finish this. We want to get to the question.
I'm almost forgetting that.
Well, can we go to the next question, please? Because we have to. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. Thank you.
process through the various points of my life. And I was just wondering how you guys feel school choices are playing a role on impacting our communities versus having the various requirements of each zone school improved versus increasing the choices that each student has to go to a different school outside of their zone.
So I'll start, and then I think it was actually part of that. I think was mentioned on the panel. Because that question we can do a whole session on just school choice and looking at really the corporatization of education. We think about the school district's budget is a $2 billion budget, $2.3 billion budget. There are folks, and to the question of capitalism, right? There are folks who are using education as a means to get access to resources, right? And there's a lot of profiteering off the suffering of black people that takes the form of school choice. A lot of the research that I've seen says that there are mixed results in terms of school choice, and that the research doesn't suggest that school choice has been at all a silver bullet. And I think many, being a person who taught at a charter school, that there isn't really much different. There isn't a whole lot of things that are different unless you actually mobilize the community, and so the community have the resources to make really decisions about the education they receive. And I'd imagine the extent to which schools that were predicated on school choice are successful to the extent that the community itself is empowered, not necessarily that the school choice itself as a framework was empowering itself. I don't know if anyone wants to add.
Also, so in Maryland, and I'm going to turn this over, in Maryland, charter schools are not actually charter schools because the employees are employees of the school district. And so this conversation around charters and school choice is much bigger than the state of Maryland. And so we had a lot of shell game here because ultimately what you're saying is this school over here gets to decide a couple more things than this school over here. But I would say it's not only foundationally having the people, it is an illusion because if you look at the most well-resourced charter schools in the city and look at their board and who is seen as the leaders of those schools, it doesn't look a lot like this room. And so then the comparison becomes between this charter school and this traditional school, and it's pitting those two against each other when this school, although new, started with a $2 million new facility, right? And HBO comes and does a documentary about its students, as if students in this school over here aren't just as beautiful and doing great things or have a great step team too, right? So when you want to talk about choice, I do believe that families should be able to move dexterously through schools. If you have a kid who is into the arts, they should be able to go to a school that has a specialty in it. Or if you have a kid who's really interested in horticulture, grandma has been teaching them about planting and growing the food that they eat, and there's a school that really has a specialty in it, that they should be able to go there too. But inherently, all of the schools should have a baseline of quality so that the choice really is about fit for the child and not escaping something that's not working for your family.
How you guys doing? My name is Jamal Giddens. This is my first time coming to a forum like this. I'm a Morgan State graduate, philosophy department, and my interest is in public policy. And first of all, I mean, I don't, as far as the justice system, I'll never believe that it was never set up for us, and I'll never believe in that particular area. But education is where I feel like we can really have an impact on our children and in our community. Now, when we talk about education reform, we talk about children, and I understand that. But I also think about, my sister, for instance, she's a social worker at a school, and she talks about a problem that she was having with a kid not coming to school. But the child's parent had a job that she had to go to about 4 in the morning, and she couldn't really monitor her child coming to school. Now, when we talk about education reform, I believe, do you guys believe that should include adults as well, as far as teaching vocational skills and giving them the ability, because when we talk about, mental makeup, and you have a parent who doesn't feel like they can provide for their family and their children, and then you get to feel, that inferiority comes in, and that could fall down to your children. So what can we do in educational reform as far as giving adult skills as well to take care of themselves and their family and be able to keep money in our community? Because our vocational schools, they're teaching like, criminal justice and all that, but, we're not teaching them plumbing and stuff in plumbing and mechanics and stuff like that, where people can actually, determine their own future with their own hands.
So what I want to do is everyone else can ask their questions, and then we'll just take them all at once so that we can wrap up.
Hello again. My issue is the children in foster care who receive an education but no marketable skills. That's one. So the quality of education, especially centered around full curriculum, needs to change, and I want to know how we can get that done. The other issue that I'm hearing from the panel and many others in the community is the funding for basically a separate education system for black children. But if we look at where our money is actually going, we can probably curb that problem. As an example, the ED for DPW, Randolph Child, is charging $716.70 for a bucket that covers your water meter every year. We can use that money. And there's so many other corporate, what I call corporate pricing, oppressions, tools for corporate oppression. We need to start looking at those things to see how we can better manage our money in this system.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Kim Humphrey. I am an education advocate for the ACLU of Maryland. I am also a part of a group that was brought up a little earlier, the Baltimore Education Coalition. I'm a city resident, and I also do my own personal organizing for many of the reasons that were brought up here. My question, and I want to say thank you so much to everyone who's up here and everything that you put forward, because it is so critical. And I have been at tables where I try to bring these things up. So we really just need a lot more backup. So I have a question about collaboration and setting a timetable for, I have said it to you, the idea of making our own table, I think is critical. No matter where you are, if you're a part of an organization where I'm currently employed, or if you're MSDE, the Maryland State Department of Education, and a lot of these other players that are making these big decisions, they do not have the sense of urgency that we have. So I would like to see us in Kerwin is something we can't hold off on, because it's decisions that will impact all of us in all of these conversations for the next 15 years. So how can we set a timeline for making that table? I would love to be at it. I would love to support and follow and help in any way that I can as being at some of those other tables. But just how can we collaborate better and bridge some of these gaps between our community? Because, kinfolk, that goes within our own community too,
Good evening, everyone. Again, thank you for having us. I'm so glad to be here. My name is Shamala McCoy. I'm Education Policy Director at ACY. I'm also a former teacher. I've taught for 10 years in Baltimore City, Delaware, and I've also taught in Africa, and I always bring that up. Baltimore City reminds me a lot of Soweto in terms of segregation. But one thing I can say is that if you are a black student who is just as black, oppressed, and poor in South Africa, you're going to graduate from high school and you know how to read and write and you have the basic skills. That's just period. And there's many reasons for that. Community responsibility, as well as the government is just not going to have you go to school and not have the basic skills that we see that's going on in Baltimore City. So it's my understanding that the education system in America was never designed to educate black students, and it never really will be. So, and it's a big system and a side conversation that I'm definitely willing to have, because some conversations are for public, but some are for private. But my question is, there's pieces in the Kerwin formula, the school finance formula. It's an oppressive system. And again, we can go private on this conversation, but a school finance formula in general is very oppressive. But there are pieces in it where I think that Black communities can gain, especially the 0 to 3 piece, where they have the birth to 3 child care subsidies, and also the high quality pre-K 3 to 4-year-olds. I think that if we could, the money's coming there regardless. And I think if we could mobilize to streamline those dollars into Black-owned community child care centers and resource centers, that we could start there. That's not the answer, and I'm more than happy to have that conversation, and I want to push for that in this session in legislation. So I'm more than happy to have that conversation. So it really does piggyback what Kim said. I want to have this seat at the table, our own table, and find out how can we take those dollars that are rightfully ours anyway and put them back into the community that needs them. We talk about community schools and all these things, and we advocate for them, but at the end of the day, they can still be oppressive because they are maintaining the status quo, and that's what I don't want to do. So wherever position or seat or table, wherever I'm in, I am bringing this conversation to light. And I want you guys to back me, because when you look at the current commission, 90% of the commissioners are white men over 60, and they're making those decisions without community, without teachers, without parents. They're making those decisions regardless. So I really want to work together and collaborate.
So what I'll ask the panelists to do is essentially, pick the pieces of the questions to answer and kind of wrap them up into, a 2 to 3 minute closing statement. One of the things I will say to respond to the last question is that I think one of the things that's going to be very important for us to do is to work collaboratively to bring to the table, or bring to a table, groups of organizations and institutions that provide those services, and begin to do the work on the policy level to make sure those resources go to the organizations that we in our community know are doing good work. One of the complicated things about that is that directing government resources, there's certain strings that are attached to it. And so organizations have to make decisions both about the extent to which that undermines their operation, but also having conversations policy-wise about how to loosen the kind of restrictions that are on certain government dollars, so that organizations aren't forced to make the choice between having to operate autonomously, but having a hard time raising money, and getting money, but having to alter their operation. And so I think that's an important policy conversation for us to have and talk about. But so we're actually going to start in reverse order. So we'll start with Jessica and come down, answer any part of the last few questions, and your closing statement.
So I wanted to answer this gentleman's question about your sister that was a social worker and that was dealing with these issues with these parents. So as we've talked about a lot on this panel, I think that a holistic method of operating schools and communities, whether it become a community school or just, operating schools in a way that we look at the needs of the child and the family, because you can't educate a child without taking into account the needs of the family as well. So I think that that's a positive direction that we can move forward towards, even just in our methods of operating before schools get more funds for it. But as teachers, as social workers, as staff members, as community members, thinking about the way that we see children operating in their communities and seeing how their families are supporting them in additional things that they need, will help our children become more successful.
So I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I think that I want to touch on that in the last sister's comment, and I want to say to you, I want to talk to you afterwards for collaboration. But the whole idea and the whole notion of educating children in a country that is built on capitalism is, we have to remember it was to warehouse our children. We have to think about at which times these school buildings were built and look at the structure. I mean, the evidence is there for us. We see, very little natural lighting coming in. It's concrete structures. It was built during industrial time because parents, women were being pulled into the factories to take over where the men were being, pulled away for war and things like that. And so it was a warehousing necessity for children, and they needed something to do during the day. And so then the idea came about to train them so that they could then become the next level of workforce. And if we are trying to get away from these things on which America is founded, that Baltimore City and Maryland are just a byproduct. I mean, we're in America. We are in the belly of the beast of capitalism, which is in bed with white supremacy. It's all one big, nice little position. I would say we could think smaller. We no longer want to warehouse our children. So why are we looking at putting them in warehouse buildings? Why are we looking at educating in these same structures, these sick buildings that do not serve our children and our families? When we go smaller, when we go community by community, when we start to look at what these smaller communities within this big city really are about, what their identities are, and who are the change makers in those communities and the elders in those communities, and what do those community elders want to tell us that we need to hear, and how can we then partner and make and create educational spaces for our children? How can we look at, we have two elder babas here, and for those of you who know anything about African-centered culture, everybody in the community is of value. So we have two men here who, and I say babas because that's a term that means father, it's a term of endearment to say that you are of value always and forever. And so you've seen all these sunrises and sunsets, you have so much to offer. We don't even have models where we are utilizing the benefits and strengths of our elders. They're in warehouses, and so we're so disconnected all over the place. Can you hear me? Yeah. We're disconnected and we're all over the place. And so I think that we have to look at how we can, bring ourselves back to connectivity. And I know it sounds idealistic, but it's actually very, very easy. And I think LBS is really creating platform from a policy level, but also on a very grassroots level to get us started and to get the ball rolling. And I see and hear from you that we all are on that same accord. And so I just say, let's step in and start doing it. It's already here.
Just really quickly, I want to answer the sister's question about foster care and where municipal fees are going. We had a state senator that was in the room. And I wish he was still here for this response, but it's incumbent upon us when we have people in office to hold them accountable, right? And so when we see the city's budget, there has to be a rallying cry to ask what portion of that money is going to community development. Our state senators and our state delegates, we need to be asking those questions of them before we give them our vote. We need to be doing voter engagement and voter turnout, because if our city can't continue to have 12%, 15% voter turnout. We need to invite people into the process at all levels so that when we have a question about where municipal fees are going, where that bucket money for each homeowner is going every year, we need to be standing up and saying, I asked you before to fund this after-school program, to fund our Readers Cross, to fund the debate program, the EduComedy debate program, but we have not seen those dollars come to the debate program. I wanted my niece to go, but they only had 10 slots this year. So where are the other 10 slots from that bucket money? So we need to also become more literate in the political process so that when we want to push a policy forward, we're not so happy in doing photo ops with someone who's saying, I want to fight for equitable funding for schools. Cool. So I want to talk to you about what's happening in schools. Are you going to sign on to that legislation as well? So I just wanted to offer that for all of us as we think about policy, because there's capital P policy and lowercase p policy, and sometimes the policy is in how we engage one another and the playing field that we set.
Cool. For the two questions about collaboration, just want to reference the thing. So Outdoor Project spawned out of the Civil Rights Movement, out of an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Interesting story, right? So SNCC it was biracial, right? It was like folks and black folks all part of the same organization, kind of working together and stuff. But the folks in SNCC understood their role if they were white, and they understood their role if they were black, and that made the collaboration work. And in fact, in the early 70s, SNCC split because there was a big debate and argument beef about what position people set in those spaces of collaboration, in those spaces of coalition.
So if folks want to work together, that's cool. The question is, know your role, or do we know our roles, and how do we make that work out? And then also being able to say that, right? Say, hey, listen, I appreciate you. This is what I need, right? And I always tell folks when they say, hey, look, we want to come work with you guys. What do you want us to do? I'll say, are you willing to scrub toilets? I say that real pointedly. No, I don't want people to scrub toilets, even though toilets do need to be scrubbed. The reason why I say that is because support looks like whatever the hell I said I need. So if you want to come around, or if you want to participate in collaboration, but it's actually you trying to slide people back to your table, that's disingenuous, and I'm just not even with it, right? The second thing is, the closing thought, we got to change the question of who is an expert. I can think of a bunch of people who don't have teacher certifications who are way better teachers than the ones in the building. But because we qualify who's good at, who's an expert based on the certifications, we got the few people who left are disconnected and came back, or the people who never here and looking for a job who came to come do stuff. And we're wanting to hold them accountable for raising and helping mold our children when actually they have shown a track record by either leaving or by coming to, of not actually being invested in this place and actually are waiting for the place to invest in them.
All right, let's go ahead and applause for So we're going to transition into our community updates, and for that, I'm going to pass it back to, well, first I'm going to give it to Adam, who's going to pass it to Lady Bree.
All right, so we're going to finish strong this afternoon. First off, give yourself a round of applause for sticking on the press. Oh yeah, y'all gonna, love that. So while they're transitioning back to their seats, and before we go to the grassroots updates from different community members, I want to do a quick commercial break. Today's event is brought to you by leaders of the beautiful struggle, Baltimore Grassroots think tank. And if you decided to come out this afternoon in the snow to support LBS, I invite you to become a sustainer of LBS. If you don't know what a sustainer is, it means that you contribute on a monthly basis to LBS, as small as $2, as much as $50. The most popular level is $10, and it's as simple as signing up for a Netflix subscription, and you can do it on your mobile phone before you leave. The website to do it is lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. If Nadir is still here, she has the iPad. She can sign up before you leave. Literally, it takes like 5 minutes, because events like these, I mean, people think that stuff like this happens because of magic, that people just kind of want to do things and come out in the snow because people just want to do that. And in 7 years' time, I can tell you it's not magic. And part of the reason that LBS has been able to do these kind of things over the years is because we have community-based support. And we pride ourselves on our financial model not being one based in getting grants or chasing money from people outside of our community, but people like you that support us on the daily basis is where our resources and support comes from. And so when we say grassroots, we really mean it, because any one of us can get a 6-figure job at some nonprofit or some philanthropic organization, but we're here in Baltimore doing this for black people because we love black people, and that's it. And so if you want to be a sustainer, you support the mission of loving black people from a policy level, I invite you to be a sustainer, and you can do that before you leave. Just want to throw that in there, just so. So now we're going to move to our community updates, and I'll bring up Lady Bree to facilitate that conversation. Just so you know, anyone who knows anything about LBS knows we're debaters, so time is important to us. So when we say 2 minutes, we mean 2 minutes. So I'll have her come up and reinforce that message for our community updates, and we'll get you back home, hopefully warm and safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. So again, this is our grassroots community updates portion. And so I'm going to call up folks who signed up to give their 2-minute community updates. I'll invite you to this podium. You can speak. I'll sit here and give you cues so you know how your time is looking. So the first person that I want to invite up is Brian Morrison, who is from William J. Watkins Senior Education Institute. Thank you.
Now, the email I got said 2 to 3 minutes.
Just 2.
Or 2.5 minutes.
I'm so sorry.
Okay, give me about 30 seconds before we start recording. Starting time. My name is Brian Morrison. I'm the founder and president of the William J. Watkins Senior Education Institute. And What we deal with is ensuring that children receive the best education possible. And what we try to do is a whole lot of stuff. But for the 2 minutes that I have, the two things that I want to focus on and pick up on the panel that was just completed. First off, educational reform is not our answer. It's not our answer. Our answer is an independent educational institutions that we develop for ourselves, by ourselves, for our children. Looking to someone else to establish an educational system that's going to train our children for the things that they need to strengthen our community, it's just not going to happen. We can go through a whole history of education and all that. Dissertation dealt with that, so we can do all of that, but I only have 2 minutes. So 2 policy pieces. One of the things that we do with our institute is we train teachers. The meantime thing to do is to make sure that the children who are in public school are getting the best education possible. And we need teachers who understand the lived experiences of our children. Our children are in schools for hours, day in and day out, with people who don't know them, don't understand them, don't know how to teach them, don't know how to develop positive relationships with them that are critical to their success in school. So one of our main issues is training teachers in culturally responsive pedagogy. We just finished this workshop this morning. We provide professional development CPD credit from MSDE for that. As far as policy goes, what I'd like to see us work on is making it a requirement that all teachers certified in the state of Maryland have to get an endorsement in culturally responsive pedagogy. We have to get one in reading, we have to get one in special education, we should also have one in culturally responsive pedagogy. That's first. Secondly, and this is more locally based, just for Baltimore, well, ideally it would be statewide, but Baltimore City needs it much more than anywhere else. And that is a requirement for high school students to have a credit, some credit, in African American history. That's something that our children need to know. They need to know about themselves, they need to know about their community, they need to know about who they are and where they come from. So those are 2 policy pieces that I think we should work on. How much time do we have?
None.
So, those are my 2 policy pieces. I'm willing to work, we're willing to work, we're willing to pay for a bus to get people to go down to Annapolis to argue and to push for culturally responsive pedagogy as a requirement for teachers.
How do people pay that for you?
You can visit our website, watkinseducation.org. You can visit I have a blog from the desk of Dr. Brian C. Morrison on WordPress. There are a number of good, I say so myself, blog posts about all these things that I'm talking about and much more. And I have some pamphlets here too that you can get contact information.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Morrison. All right, can we give him a hand? All right. All right, so our next community update is coming from Corey Gaper from Baltimore Movement of Rank and File Educators.
Hello everyone, and thank you for having me. So I'm a 6th grade teacher in the city, and I'm working with a group called Baltimore Movement of Rank and File Educators, which is a caucus of the Baltimore Teachers Union that's working to transform the Teachers Union from a reactive institution that only looks out for teacher pay and benefits to a proactive fighting organization that uses resources and its people to be a transformative political force in the community, and there are examples elsewhere in the country where this is possible. So right now we're working basically to be the union that we wish the union was being, but isn't currently being right now. And one of the things we wish they were fighting for in this current process, go back to 2008, you got the casino vote, people get the casinos in, the only reason they voted for it is because it bring all this extra money to our schools. It was a big bait and switch. Since then it hasn't added a single cent to our schools, because basically what it's done is it said, now we got all this money in the Education Trust Fund, we're going to just put it through the formula that we already had that existed. So instead of general fund revenue supporting that formula, now the casino money's using it, I can just take that general fund revenue, put it elsewhere, spend it wherever I want. This does not solve all of our problems, but there is a piece of legislation that we're working on right now that will be put out this coming session that will basically say, no, that money's going to do what it was intended to. It is protected outside of the formula. It goes on top of the formula. And furthermore, the manner in which that money is distributed will be distributed based on, with priority given the communities who've been most affected by the historical educational debt that kids across the state have received. And of course, that's going to go across lines of race and poverty, meaning places like Baltimore will get the resources they need and deserve and have been cheated out of for the past forever, but specifically we've approved $3 billion over the past 20 years, according to the state's own definition of adequacy. So by their own means, they failed Baltimore City kids by $3 billion over the past 20 years. This is one of the most piece that I wanted to bring that to this one.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gabriel. If folks want to join you in your efforts, how can they get in contact with you?
Sure. So we do have a website, bemorecaucus.org, where you can see a lot of the work that we're doing, ways to contact us. So I say that's the best way. And call me or Natalia and Christina and Keisha over there as well for you to talk to people in person.
Thank you so much, Corey.
Thank you.
All right, can we give him a round of applause? All right, so our next speaker is going to be Rosita Martin.
Because of my love for humanity and my love for children. And I recognize that although my two grandchildren were never abused or neglected, they were collected and processed into the Baltimore City foster care program, where my grandson was medically abused for 8 years. They rendered him brain damage, cut open his spine, exposed him to experimental therapies and medications, and then they murdered him in 2014 in opposition to giving him that. My granddaughter, who was gifted in talent, was called mentally retarded by the court, even though she spoke 4 languages, English, French, Arabic, and Spanish. She was doing 8th grade math in the 1st grade and was reading before she was 1. This child was mentally retarded and thrown into a mental institution for somebody else's benefit. And these kind of horror stories are carried throughout the foster care program, and primarily against poverty-stricken people. And this shouldn't be occurring anywhere on earth, but it is. So the advocacy through what started out as a campaign here in Baltimore City, which is accountability and justice in medical abuse and foster care corruption, I had the privilege of actually holding hands and trading information with the Queen of Ghana, Africa. And she is in support. We have support from Zimbabwe and Britain, UK, so many other places around the world that have actually taken a look at what's happening to the children. The children are our future. We destroy the children. What legacy do we have for humanity? So I ask that each and every one of you become an advocate for these children, my children, your children, and children around the world. I bring that to you, and I hope to hear from you. I'm online throughout all of the social media.
Thank you so much. All right, so our next speaker is going to be Cliff Coomba from 6th Region Diaspora Caucus.
Before I begin, I'd like to humbly ask permission of my elders to speak. I've got some words to be folks, and I'm going to talk like an officer. First, I want to thank leaders of the youthful struggle for bringing this forum together, bringing together all these organizations who are sharing their effort to go from the whereas to the now therefore, which too few organizations do, and to help us organize ourselves and make our own table, as has been said several times. My name is Brother Cliff. I'm the Maryland State Facilitator of the 6th Region Diaspora Caucus, or SRDC. Our mission is to elevate the voice of the grassroots Pan-African communities from the local level to the national and global level. We were founded in 2006 on a national level in response to an invitation by the African Union to the diaspora to establish our voice in the AUS voting members. The Maryland organization was established in 2007 when we held our first town hall. We are currently on a mission to take that voice of the Pan-African diaspora to the African Union, the United Nations, or even independent organizations such as the Pan-African Federalist Movement, if they will listen to our voice on the world stage. We're currently organizing in 6 states in the United States, which means we still have a lot of work to do and a long way to go. We're fortunate to have organizational allies in Canada, Central America, the Caribbean, and in Europe, who are helping to spread our message to North America, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, Europe, and Asia, all the Pan-African and African-descended communities there. Our process starts at the local level, where we hold Pan-African community town hall meetings. The community is invited to attend, help establish a list of concerns and ideas. We call it a Pan-African agenda. They also nominate and seat a grassroots community council of elders. They also nominate and elect spokespeople for the community known as state representatives. The states then gather in an annual national summit where we take all of our agendas, all of our positions, put them together and organize how we will advance our cause onto the international arena. One of the aspects that we realize needs to be dealt with, and that is the idea of building and presenting a unified diaspora-wide front to international organizations. If this plan is to succeed, we must be unified as a community. However, too many of us seem to be locked into a specific area of expertise, a stay in your lane philosophy, if you will, insisting that voting is the only way, or that economics is the answer, or that we simply need to pray on it, or culture will heal the world, or the only solution is revolution. And as a result, we often proceed down our lane, oblivious that there are other ideas that might actually assist us in implementing our own. So again, I'm glad you're voting this. Our proposal to continue forward is to develop a cooperative coalition of Pan-African organizations, one that is proactive, one that is intentional. We actually have a name for it we call Spokes of the Wheel. As far as what we are doing this year, we've had 5 Pan-African town halls in the last year. We're going to have 6 more next year. We're seeing a Pan-African Grassroots Council of Elders, and we are in the process of building this Pan-African coalition.
Brother Cliff, we want to ask you
I want to thank you all for granting us this opportunity to speak, and I want to just invite you to join with us, join with each other. We say, let's go together. Let's form this cooperative Pan-African coalition. Thank you very much.
And how can they get in contact with you, Brother Cliff?
You can reach our organization. We have a website, srdcinternational.org. You can contact me at Cliff, C-L-I-F-F, at kuumbareport.com. I also have some cards and information if anyone's interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brother. All right, excellent. Our next speaker is Claudia Barber.
Good afternoon, and I thank the leaders of A Beautiful Struggle for this beautiful forum and opportunity to share about the legislative agenda for 2018. I am actually a 2016 judicial candidate for judge on the circuit court for Anne Arundel County. At this present time, there has been a lack of diversity on the circuit court in this specific county, and there have also been similar situations in other rural counties. So the purpose here, I am also a member of the Anne Arundel County chapter of the NAACP, and I work currently in the legislative arm of that county chapter. So we are going to be pushing this upcoming legislative session, monitoring legislation, and hopefully getting the ear of legislators to develop more oversight of the Judicial Nominating Commission members, and for example, commission members, when counties have no people of color on the bench or only one person of color, the commission should consider all applicants qualified in accordance with the Maryland Constitution. And the commission members should not be allowed to limit the number of qualified applicants making the short list. Those are some of the issues, and the commission members should be vetted to answer such questions as, have you taken extensive diversity training within the past 5 months, and what is your idea of a fair-minded jurist? And do they belong to any social organizations promoting ideologies that are or may be offensive to races? So these are just some of the initiatives that we had in mind, and I'm again presenting this on behalf of the Anne Arundel County chapter of the NAACP. Reverend Stephen Tillett has been an active voice, as well as the Caucus of African American Leaders, Carl Snowden in Anne Arundel County. They both have been strong leaders in the community, and wish that there should be more diversity again on circuit courts. Thank you.
And how can they get in contact with you, Ms. Barber?
My email address is claudia.abarber@aol.com, and you can also connect with the Anne Arundel County chapter of the NAACP. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. A minute, 54 seconds. All right. So our next speaker is, and excuse me if I mispronounce your name, Heather Illith from Maryland Nonprofits.
That's close enough. It's Heather Iliff. Yeah, thank you. So thank you so much, LBS, for having us today and this really illuminating forum. My name is Heather Iliff. I'm the CEO of Maryland Nonprofits, and I think Nadira and Adam and Devon probably made a little exception because we are not actually a grassroots organization. We don't want to pretend to be. We are pretty mainstream. But we are listening and wanting to be part of the solution. We have about 1,200 members across the state of Maryland who are nonprofit organizations, and definitely we're attentive to these issues of the nonprofit industrial complex. I will say that nearly half of our members are less than $100,000 in revenue and very community-based, and a quarter are less than $25,000 in revenue and all volunteer. And we do a lot of work with youth-serving organizations and leaders in Baltimore communities that are trying to raise money for community-based programs that they're working on. And to that end, the state of Maryland funds a free program called the Nonprofit Development Center. If your organization, if you're from a nonprofit that's less than $750,000 in revenue and less than 10 years old, you can get great free resources. So take one of these if you fall into that category. Pass around. Thank you. So I'm here today to talk about, again, admittedly not grassroots, but affecting all of us, are these horrible changes coming down from the federal government. We did an op-ed about tax reform truly being devastating. It's especially devastating for Baltimore because it's not only going to completely cut out resources for Baltimore, but it's also going to raise Baltimore's taxes because we do have the higher local taxes and those will not be able to be written off. And so that puts even more pressure on the tax base here to fund the community investment that's really needed. So we have a statewide coalition. You are the first audience to see this resolution. This is hot off the press. We're in the quiet phase. We haven't launched the website yet. It's called Activate Maryland. And the goal is to protect Marylanders from these horrible federal changes that are happening so that we can take control here in Maryland of our own budget and the investment that we make in the communities. So one of the resolve clauses is to commit to assuring that all Marylanders have access to excellent education and quality health care, healthy environment, adequate housing and safe neighborhoods, recreation and cultural experiences, economic opportunity and productive employment, and fair and adequate compensation for their labor. So if you agree with these goals, please sign this resolution, and I can collect it at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, I'm going to call up Keisha Goodwin from B-More.
Good afternoon, my name is Keisha Goodwin from B-More, and I am the part of public and assessments. During my educational career in Baltimore City Schools, I only tested once a year in each grade level. And when I got to high school, I had one math test, one reading test, citizenship, and writing for all 4 years. So as an educator in this system today, I'm not understanding how we got to a point or we are over-testing our students. So I would like some help in organizing to enforce the law that passed that's called the More Learning, Less Testing Act, where they have limited testing to 2.2 for pre-K through 7th grade and 2.3 for 8th grade, and I think around 2.5 for high school. And there are other things that are in place, such as forming an educational committee to help mandate and implement and evaluate this law in schools and to hold the district accountable. However, I'm finding that the district has not formed this committee, and not too many people know about the law, and not too many of us are asking about this committee to inform the district on that over-testing.
I am also a member of Be More. In addition to the casino bill and the less testing, I'm going to steal some time to tell you about a Black Lives Matter in Schools Week of Action that we are trying to plan for February 5th through 11th. It started in Seattle 2 years ago, in Philly last year, and this year Baltimore signed on to put this in our schools, lessons, activities, and also there's a national list of demands, such as focus our schools on restorative justice and zero tolerance, stop the attack on Black teachers, and mandate K-12 Black history and ethnic studies. And we're looking to make this more local to Baltimore, sign on to these national demands, but also make our own Baltimore demands, and also get as many teachers, organizations together. So far, our Algebra Project is signed on as a partner, and we're looking for more partners in planning and making this a great first year that we're trying this in Baltimore.
Natalia, if people want to connect with you about that effort, where should they go? What should they do?
Sure. On our website, bemorecaucus.org, there's an info page and a contact page. You can put in your name and that you're interested in helping with the Black Lives Matter in Schools Week of Action.
All right, thank you so much, ladies. And we've come to our last presentation. So I want to call up Nika Namdi from Fight, Light, Be More.
I probably really don't even need a mic, I speak where I am. But Fight Like Be More is a two-part initiative to help people in communities to educate themselves about the impact economically, socially, and physically of blighted properties, which are vacant, abandoned, underused, or misutilized properties, which Baltimore has many. I'm doing this work through my role as the Director of Community Wellness at the Living Well. So if you're interested in any blight-related issues, or you know of any blight-related issues and you're having challenges dealing with a particular property, please email me at fightblightbemore@gmail.com. I'm also here representing Intentional Community Building Collective, which is a group of families primarily right now working to develop co-housing in West Baltimore, which would also help to remediate blight. And my last group that I'm representing is the Living Well Intentional Community Building Collective, and LBS. We are throwing a very innovative arts and social advocacy event for the premiere of the movie Black Panther. It's going to be on February 17th, starting at 3 o'clock. If you're interested in more information about the movie premiere, the panel, and the party, please, you can check us out on Facebook at Intentional Community Building Collective. You can also look at the Living Wells page or the LBS page on Facebook.
And y'all should come because I'm performing.
Yes. Sure. My name is Nika Nam.
Oh, I'm sorry, I pronounced your last name. All right, so thank you so much for all of our community updates. Can we give all of our presenters a So I want to close out by inviting back our CEO to give closing remarks.
So thank you for coming out again. I've actually forgot to mention that Black Panther event. I am super excited about Black Panther coming out. I love comic books. Well, then we're gonna go to the theater and watch together. I mean, the thing is, we're gonna wear African garb to the theater. We're gonna have a whole processional to the theater. You should go.
Yes, please do.
So one last remark. Actually, I forgot to mention this earlier. I mentioned to say something earlier about this. But LBS has been a big part of the effort around the youth fund, the $12 million youth fund that the city passed last November. And we actually got the good news that on Thursday, the city council passed the bill that's going to start the process of us making the youth fund racially equitable. So we're really proud of that. We're happy about that. And I mentioned that because if you like that, then you should be a sustainer. Just saying. But yes, we want to make sure everyone gets home safely, happy, and healthy tonight. Make sure you look around you, pick up any trash you may have left with you in the pew. And see us outside if you want us to get any more information about LBS, not just being a sustainer, but following up any political actions you've heard about here today. If you signed up online, then you are automatically added to our email list, so you'll get future updates from LBS about events like this. So go home, be happy, be healthy. God bless. Thank you.